I was rich at 45 and broke at 60. Here's what money actually was by the time I was 45 years old. I had more money than my father earned in his entire lifetime. And I want to tell you that I am not saying that to impress you. I am saying it because it is the context for everything that happened next. And because the next part is the part that took me 20 years to understand. My name is Gerald. I'm 72 years old, and by the time I was 60, I had lost most of it. And what the losing showed me about what the having had actually been is the thing I have been trying to find the right words for ever since. I want to tell you the whole story, because the partial version, the version that is simply about a man who made money and lost money and learned a lesson, is not the story I'm trying to tell. The story I am trying to tell is about what money actually is, not in the economic sense, not in the philosophical sense that people mean when they say money can't buy happiness, which is a sentence I have heard so many times it has lost whatever meaning it originally had. I mean what it actually was in my specific life, what function it was performing that I did not understand while it was performing it, and what became visible about that function when it was gone. I grew up in a small city in central Texas in the 1960s, the son of a man who drove a delivery truck for 30 years, and a woman who worked as a bookkeeper for a medical practice, and who brought the same precise attention to the family's finances that she brought to her professional ones, which meant that we always knew exactly where we stood, which was not wealthy and not in genuine hardship, but in the specific middle territory, where there is always enough and never much more than enough, and where the consciousness of that margin shapes everything from the groceries you buy, to the clothes you wear, to the particular quality of attention you bring to the question of what things cost. I was the first person in my family to go to college, which in my family was understood as an achievement of the kind that changes the trajectory of a line, that bends it upward in ways that are supposed to compound across generations. I went to the University of Texas on a combination of scholarship and loans and the particular determination of a young man who has understood, from watching his parents negotiate the thin margin, that the negotiation is not the life he wants, and that college is the mechanism by which the not wanting becomes not having to. I studied business, which I chose not out of passion, but out of calculation, the calculation of a first-generation college student who understands that the credential needs to be legible to employers, and that the passion can be sorted out once the financial question is settled. I graduated in 1974 and went to work for a real estate development company in Dallas, which was, in the mid-1970s, a city that was beginning the particular kind of expansion that produces the particular kind of opportunity that young men with ambition and a tolerance for risk find irresistible. I found it irresistible. I learned the business with the thoroughness of someone who understands that learning the business is the first form of capital available to a person who doesn't yet have the financial kind. And I was, within 3 years, doing deals of my own on a small scale, finding properties that were undervalued, and understanding why they were undervalued, and figuring out what it would take to change that. I had a talent for it. I want to say that honestly, because I think it matters to understand that what I built was not an accident, and was not purely luck, though luck was present, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. I had a genuine ability to see potential in places that other people's assessments had concluded were without it, to understand the relationship between a property and its surrounding context, and to anticipate how that relationship would change over time, and that ability, combined with the willingness to act on it before the change was fully visible to everyone else, is the basic mechanism by which money accumulates in real estate, and I was good at the mechanism. By my mid-30s, I was doing well in the specific way that well means in real estate development, which is that the projects were getting larger, and the returns were getting larger, and reputation was developing in the particular way that reputation develops in industries where everyone knows who is doing what, where the track record becomes its own form of currency, opening doors that would otherwise require years of additional cultivation. I was married by then to a woman named Sandra, who I had met at a party in 1978, and who I had pursued with the same focused determination I brought to everything I wanted, which was effective as a courtship strategy, and which contained, I understand now, the seeds of some of the difficulties that came later. Sandra was smart and capable, and had her own career in marketing that she had built with genuine effort, and that she cared about seriously. And we built a life together that was, in the early years, genuinely collaborative. Two people working toward something shared with a mutual understanding of what they were working toward and why. We had 2 children, a son named Derek in 1982 and a daughter named Michelle in 1985. And the house we lived in when Derek was born was a good house in a good neighborhood. And the house we moved to when Michelle was 4 was considerably larger and in a neighborhood that announced, in the way that neighborhoods do, that the people living in it had arrived somewhere. The arriving was important to me. I want to examine that honestly, because I think the arriving is where the actual story begins, underneath the story about money and real estate and the mechanics of accumulation. The arriving was important to me in a way that went beyond the comfort it provided or the security it represented, in a way that I can only describe from the distance of 72 years, as the way that proof is important to a person who is not yet certain of the thing being proved. I had grown up watching my father drive his delivery truck through neighborhoods like the one I eventually lived in, watching him deliver things to people whose address was itself a statement about who they were and what they were worth. And something in me had filed that observation under a heading that I did not articulate consciously, but that functioned as a motivating force for most of my adult life, which was the heading that said, "Get to the other side of the window." The delivery truck had a window. My father was on one side of it. The neighborhoods he drove through were on the other side. What I wanted, from the time I was old enough to understand what wanting something like that meant, was to be on the other side of the window, and by my late 30s, I was on the other side of the window by any external measure available. And the being there felt, I want to be honest about this, like exactly what I had expected it to feel like, which is to say, it felt like vindication, like proof, like the settling of an account that had been open since I was 12 years old. Watching my father pull up to houses, I understood we were not the kind of people who lived in. And then I wanted more, which is how it works, and which I understood theoretically, but had not experienced personally until I experienced it, which is the only way some lessons are available. The proof that felt sufficient at 38 felt insufficient at 42, not because the circumstances had changed, but because the need the proof was serving had not been resolved by the proving, which is what happens when you try to answer a question about your worth with evidence about your wealth, because the question is not actually about wealth, and the evidence, however substantial, does not actually address it. By the time I was 45, I was worth, in the net sense, somewhere in the range of $12 to $15 million, depending on how you valued the portfolio at any given moment, which is a range that I describe with the deliberate inexactness of someone who understands that the exactness at this distance is not the point. The point is that it was enough, by any reasonable standard, to constitute the arrival I had been working toward, and that I knew it was enough and continued anyway, expanding the portfolio and taking on larger projects and more leverage and more complexity, because stopping had never been part of the plan, and because I did not understand yet what stopping might have revealed about what the continuing was for. Sandra and I had been having difficulties since the early 90s, difficulties of the kind that develop in marriages when two people have been so thoroughly organized around the external project of building, something that they have not maintained the internal project of staying known to each other across the years of the building. We were, by the mid-90s, people who shared a house and a schedule and a set of financial interests and 2 children they both loved, and who had become, in the way that busy people become things without noticing the becoming, strangers to each other in most of the ways that actually matter. The strangeness was not hostile. I want to say that it was simply the natural result of 2 people who had been looking outward at the same thing for 15 years without looking at each other. and who had arrived at a point where looking at each other required a reintroduction that neither of them was sure they knew how to make. We divorced in 1997. I am not going to spend a great deal of time on the divorce because I do not think it is the most important part of the story, though it is a part, because the financial settlement of the divorce was the first significant reduction of the portfolio I had spent 20 years building, and the reduction was the first time I had experienced the loss of something I had accumulated, and the experience of that loss was instructive in ways I did not fully process at the time, but that were laying groundwork for the larger lessons that came later. What the divorce showed me, in the moment of it, was that the money was real, which sounds obvious, but what I mean is that the loss of it felt real in a way that the having of it had not felt real in the same way. The way you don't fully understand the weight of something until you feel the difference in your hands when it's gone. I had understood the money, while I had it, primarily as a score, as the numerical representation of how the game was going, and the divorce was the first time I had felt the loss of it as a loss of something actual, something that had protected me from things I had not been paying attention to because I was protected from them. I rebuilt. Of course I rebuilt, because rebuilding was what I did, and because the identity I had constructed was so thoroughly organized around the accumulation and the deal-making that the alternative to rebuilding was a confrontation with questions I was not yet prepared to sit with. I was 50 years old, post-divorce, post-settlement, and I went back to work with the same determination I had brought to the work at 25, which was either admirable or a symptom of something, depending on where you are standing when you assess it. And from where I am standing now, I think it was both simultaneously. The next decade was a version of the previous two, scaled and modified by the changed circumstances, but essentially continuous in its character. The same orientation toward the next deal and the next project and the next proof, conducted now from a smaller base, but with the same fundamental assumptions about what the work was for and what success at it would produce. I was good at it, and the portfolio grew, and by 55 I was approaching the level I had been at before the divorce, which felt like restoration, like the correction of a disruption, rather than the continuation of a pattern that had already shown me what it was. And then the financial crisis of 2008 arrived, and what it showed me about what I had built was the most expensive education of my life. I want to describe what happened without the dramatic framing that financial ruin stories sometimes use, because what happened was not dramatic in its mechanism. It was simply the ordinary operation of leverage in a declining market, which is the mechanism by which real estate developers who have borrowed against the value of their portfolio discover that the value of their portfolio is not the fixed and reliable quantity they had understood it to be. I had borrowed heavily, which was how the business worked and how I had always operated it, using the equity in existing projects to fund new ones, which is a strategy that works reliably in expanding markets, and that works in the opposite direction with equal reliability when the market contracts. The market contracted in 2008 in a way and at a speed that the models I had been using to make decisions did not adequately account for, and by 2010 I had lost, through the combination of declining valuations and the obligations that the leverage had created, the substantial majority of what I had rebuilt in the post-divorce decade. By the time I was 60, I was not technically broke. I want to be accurate. I had some assets remaining and a smaller portfolio of properties that survived the contraction. But I was, relative to where I had been at 45, in a position that required a fundamental reassessment of what the next chapter of my life was going to look like and how it was going to be funded. I want to tell you about the 6 months after I understood what had happened, because those 6 months were the most interior 6 months of my life, the period in which I was forced, by the absence of the forward momentum that had been the primary organizing principle of my existence for 35 years, to sit with questions I had been moving too fast to hear for most of my adult life. The first question was about the money itself, what it had actually been, and this is where I want to spend some time, because I think my answer to it is the thing that might be most useful to you. The money had been, I understood in those 6 months, a story. Not in the sense that it wasn't real, because it was real. It bought real things and provided real security and opened real doors, and its loss created real constraints. But it had been, beneath the reality of it, a story I was telling about myself, a narrative about who I was and what I was worth and what my life meant. And the story was so thoroughly constructed and so consistently maintained across 3.5 decades that I had not, until its supporting evidence was substantially removed, been able to see it as a story at all. I had understood it as fact. The net worth was a fact. The portfolio was a fact. The address and the car and the membership and the table at the restaurant were facts, and together those facts constituted, in my understanding of them, the answer to a question I had been asking since I was 12 years old, watching my father through the window of a delivery truck. The question was whether I was enough, whether I was the kind of person who mattered, whether the circumstances of my origin were the definition of my worth, or whether I could exceed them. And the money had been, for 35 years, the answer I was building toward that question. When the money was substantially reduced, the question was still there. That was the discovery. The answer had not resolved the question, had never resolved the question, had only covered it in the way that a sufficiently large accumulation of evidence covers a doubt, temporarily, and without touching the doubt itself. And what the 2008 crisis stripped away was not only the money, but the covering. And what was underneath, it was the same question that had been there at 12, unchanged and unanswered, and still, at 60, requiring a response. My son Derek came to see me in the period after the losses became clear, and we had a conversation that I have thought about more times than I can count in the 12 years since. He was 28 years old, and he had built a small business of his own. Nothing like what I had built, but something real that he had made himself, and that he was genuinely proud of. And he sat across from me at the kitchen table of the house I had moved into, after selling the larger one, and he asked me, with the directness of a young man who loves his father and who has been watching his father for 28 years with more attention than I had given him credit for, whether I was okay. Not financially. He was clear that he didn't mean financially. He meant okay in the interior sense, in the sense of whether the person underneath the portfolio was intact and functional, and not in a condition that required more than he could see. I told him I was fine, reflexively, because fine was what I said and what I had always said. And then I stopped and looked at him and understood that he was asking something real, and that the real question deserved a real answer. And I said, honestly, I don't know. I'm finding out who I am without the thing I used to be, and I don't know yet what I'm finding. He nodded in the way of someone who has been waiting for a long time for a particular kind of honesty to become available, and who is not going to do anything to interrupt it now that it has arrived. And then he said, Dad, I've been waiting for you to not know something for a long time. It's actually a relief. That sentence hit me in a place that the financial losses had not reached, which was the place where the question about whether I was enough actually lived. And what it did there was not answer the question, but change it. Change it from a question about net worth and external achievement to a question about whether the person I had been across 50 years of relentless forward momentum was someone his son could find, when the momentum stopped, actually there. I am 72 years old, and I am, by any measure of the kind I used to apply to myself, not wealthy. I have a modest house and a small income from the remnants of the portfolio, and a life that is, in its external dimensions, unremarkable by the standards I operated by for most of my adult life. I am also, and I want to say this with the care it deserves, more genuinely at ease than I was at 45 with $15 million, which is a sentence I could not have predicted at 45, and which I am still, at 72, in the process of fully understanding. The ease comes from the answer to the question that the money never answered. Not a dramatic answer, not a revelation, but the slow and accumulating evidence of the years since 2010, in which I have been, without the forward momentum to organize my attention around, actually present in my own life in a way that I was not for the 35 years of the building. Present to Derek and Michelle, who know me now in a way they did not know me when the portfolio was full and my attention was elsewhere. Present to the work I do now, which is teaching a course in entrepreneurship at a community college 2 days a week, teaching young people who are in the position I was in at 22, first generation determined, trying to figure out how to build something, and trying to teach them what I understand now that I did not understand then, which is that the building is worth doing, and that understanding what you're building it for is at least as important as the building itself. I tell them about my father. I tell them about the delivery truck and the window and what I understood at 12, and what that understanding cost me across the decades I spent proving the understanding wrong. I tell them that the question their money is going to try to answer is probably not a question about money, and that the trying will not fail exactly, but will also not succeed in the way they are expecting it to succeed. And that knowing that in advance is not the same as being free of the pattern, but is at least the beginning of an awareness that might, if they are luckier than I was or pay better attention, allow them to ask the question more directly before the alternative becomes too expensive. The delivery truck is still in me. I want to be honest about that, because I think the story of a man who lost his money and found his soul is too clean to be accurate. And inaccuracy is not what I am here to offer you. The 12-year-old who decided what the window meant is still present in me in ways. I can feel when my current circumstances are compared, by someone or by my own internal accounting, to what they once were. And the feeling is not comfortable and does not pretend to be. But it is smaller than it was, and I understand it better than I did. And the understanding has not eliminated it, but has changed my relationship to it, has made it something I can observe and name and decline to be entirely governed by, which is a different condition than the one I was in for the 35 years when I was being entirely governed by it without knowing I was being governed at all. Money is real. I want to say that clearly at the end of this, because I think the lesson that is sometimes drawn from stories like mine is that money doesn't matter, and that is not what I am telling you. Money matters in the practical sense, and in the security sense, and in the sense of the real options it creates, and the real constraints its absence imposes. I know both sides of that equation from personal experience, and I am not going to pretend that the constrained side is the same as the unconstrained side, because it is not. What I am telling you is that money, in my experience of having it and losing it across 35 years of making it the primary organizing principle of my existence, was also something else, was simultaneously the practical thing it is, and the story I was telling myself about who I was and whether I was enough. And that the story and the practical thing got so thoroughly entangled in my life that I could not separate them while I was inside the entanglement, and that losing the money did not resolve the story, but did, finally and at considerable cost, make the story visible, and that the visibility was the beginning of the thing I had actually been looking for since I was 12 years old, which was not the proof that I was worth something, but the direct experience of being someone whose worth was not contingent on the proof. Derek calls me every Sunday. We talk for a long time about things that have nothing to do with money, about his business and his children, and what he is reading and what he is thinking about. And in those calls, I am present in a way that I was not present at the table where deals were made, or in the office where the portfolio was managed, or in any of the rooms where the accumulation was occurring. I am present because there is nothing else to be present to, which sounds like a loss, and is also, in the most important sense I know, exactly what presence requires. My father drove his truck for 30 years, and he came home every evening, and he sat at the dinner table with his family, and he knew our names and our teachers' names and the names of the things we cared about. He was, in the terms I now understand to be the relevant ones, present in his own life with a consistency and a completeness that I, with $15 million at my peak and all the rooms on the right side of the window, never quite managed. I am managing it now, imperfectly and without the covering that the money provided, with the question still present and less frightening than it was, with my son's voice on Sunday evenings and my students' faces on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and the small modest house that is, in every way that I am finally capable of measuring, exactly enough. That is what the money actually was. The long way to here, which I could have reached sooner and didn't, and which I am grateful to have reached at all.